In this Sikha, the Rebbe is speaking about the mitzvah called Ha'anaka, giving gifts to a Jewish slave when he goes free. And the Sefer HaChinuch writes in regards to this mitzvah that even though these days the mitzvah does not apply, because we don't have Yovel these days, we don't have the dinim of Eved Ivri these days, we could still learn out a lesson from it, that this is the decent and the right, the moral thing to do, that if you hire a worker, when he finishes working for you, you should give him gifts from that which Hashem has blessed you with. The Minchas Chinuch, who comments on the Chinuch, says that the fact that you could learn out from the mitzvah of Ha'anaka to a worker, to an employee these days, because this is the ethical, the right, the nice thing to do, only works according to one opinion of the Gemara. And that is that the mitzvah of Ha'anaka applies to all slaves equally, whether a slave that was sold by Beis Din or a slave that had sold himself into slavery. If it applies to all avodim, to all slaves, so then you could say that it's obviously because this is the nice thing to do, the ethical thing to do, and we apply it to a worker these days as well. However, according to the other opinion of the Gemara that says that Ha'anaka only applies to an Eved that was sold by Beis Din, because that's where the Pasuk says it, to give Ha'anaka, to give these gifts, and the Pasuk says, Ha'anik Tanik Loi, you should give him gifts, which sounds like it's excluding someone else. So they say it's excluding a person that sold himself. So then clearly it's not just because of being nice, and being the nice and right thing to do, because then it should apply to all slaves. And if that's not the reason, then we also wouldn't use it to apply to an employee these days. The Minchas Chinuch, however, has the following problem. Based on what we just said, this idea of Ha'anaka, as the Chinuch puts it, that applies these, and we should do it these days as well, because that's the nice thing to do. As we said, it should only apply if you say that that Ha'anaka applies to both types of slaves. The Rambam, however, clearly says it only applies to the slave that was sold by Beis Din, not to the person that sold himself. Which then should follow that we shouldn't do Ha'anaka these days. So the Chinuch seems to be then arguing with the Rambam, because the Chinuch says it does apply these days. And the Chinuch would have to seemingly go with the opinion that it applies to all the Avodim equally. Usually the Chinuch is not arguing with the Rambam, and that's where the Minchas Chinuch is having a difficulty over here. So in order to explain this, the Rebbe says that really the idea that the Pasuk is telling us a Chidush, that Ha'anaka applies to the person who was sold by Beis Din, not to the person who sold himself, this can really be understood in two ways. One way of understanding it is that the concept of Ha'anaka, of giving gifts, that is the Chidush. In other words, we wouldn't have said it by ourselves, so the Torah says it to us by the Machru, Beis Din, by the person who was sold by Beis Din, and we have a rule. If it's a Chidush, then it's a novel idea, then we only apply it to where the Torah says it, and therefore it's only going to apply to the person who was sold by Beis Din, not to the person who sold himself. And if that's the case, we also wouldn't use it for a worker these days. The other way of understanding what's going on here is the opposite. The Chidush that the Pasuk is telling you is that you don't give it to the person who sold himself. Not that the person who's sold by Beis Din gets the Ha'anaka. In other words, the fact that a person should get gifts, that's the understandable thing. That's the given. The Chidush is not to give it to the person who sold himself. If that's the case, since what are we speaking about? A person, an employee these days, which is clearly not in the category of a person that sold himself into slavery. So therefore, you could learn out from the Ha'anaka that it should apply even these days to a person who's working. So in other words, even according to the opinion, like the Rambam, that says it only works for a Machru Beis Din, not for a person that sold himself, but it's not that the Torah is telling you only Machru Beis Din. The Torah is just excluding a person that sold himself. So clearly a worker these days who is not in that category could get the Ha'anaka, and therefore there's no contradiction anymore between the Minchas Chinuch, between what the Chinuch is saying, to give a worker gifts these days, to that which the Rambam says, that a person that sold himself into slavery doesn't get gifts. The Rebbe says these two ways of looking at it, again, whether the Chidush is that you give anyone gifts, or the Chidush is that you don't give to the person who sold himself, is based on two different ways of understanding these gifts. One way of understanding the gift is that it's a sort of payment for the work. Now, if it's a payment for the work, technically you paid him already, whatever needs to be paid. So that's why we're saying it's a Chidush from the Torah that Nevertheless, a person that was sold by Beis Din, we give him this extra payment as well. And that's why we're not going to apply it to other cases. The other way of looking at it is that it's a concept of tzedakah. In other words, we're giving an extra recognition to the servant for what he had done. It's not a payment. And if that's the case, then, again, the natural thing is that we give it to everyone. For whatever reason, the Torah is saying that a person that sold himself does not get it. So now, where does the Rambam fit into this? Says the Rebbe, the Rambam would fit into the second way of understanding that it's a way of tzedakah, and therefore it should apply to everyone, unless the Torah clearly says that it doesn't. Why is the Rebbe saying that the Rambam would say it's part of tzedakah? Because the Rebbe says, when you look in the Sefer HaMitzvahs, when the Rambam enumerates all the mitzvahs asay, where does the Rambam put this mitzvah of Hanukah? Not amongst the mitzvahs of the Eved, but rather he puts it right after the mitzvah of tzedakah. And therefore, if he's putting it there, once again, it makes sense to say that the Rambam is viewing it that this is a natural thing that we need to do in all cases. This is the ethical thing, this is the nice way of acting. For whatever reason, the Torah excludes the person who sold himself, but definitely these days, we should be giving to a worker as well. Says the Rebbe, since now we can understand that this applies according to all opinions, the Rambam could also agree with this. Therefore, the Rebbe says it's really worthwhile to publicize this Sairah. People should pay attention to it. That if a person hires a worker and then the time of the work is over, especially if you actually fired the person before the time is up, the Rebbe says we're not speaking about a person that quit by himself. That's a different category. Then there's no mitzvah of Hanukah. But if a person was left off his job, whether it's because of redundancy, there's plenty of workers without him, or because the boss is not happy with his work, there needs to be this idea of giving these extra bonuses, these extra gifts. And the Rebbe says you can't just be yoitz. It's obvious. First, the fact that you have to pay him for all his work, that goes without saying. Even the things that have been made up in advance, certain things that would come at the end of the job, obviously also you have to give. That's not a question. But the Rebbe is saying in addition to all of this, because those wouldn't be considered tzedakah, so clearly you have to give above and beyond all of that, that which could be considered an extra bonus, which would be like the idea of tzedakah that we're talking about. And clearly, says the Rebbe, this has nothing to do whether this person brought you success or not. If he brought you success, then clearly you have to give him more and more based on the brachas that Hashem gave you because of him. The Rebbe now applies all of this in Avodah Ruchnis. First, the Rebbe brings something that his father, Rebbe Levi Yitzchak, says in regards to the idea of an Eved Ivri. The Rebbe's father says that an Eved Ivri is functioning on the level of what's called Moichen de Katnus, a smaller level of intellectual capacity. When he goes out free, Hanukah represents that he's now going to get Moichen de Gadlus, a much higher level of intellect. He connects this also with the three kinds of things that it's supposed to be given as Hanukah, and they correspond to the three different levels of intellect. But the Rebbe applies this all in a practical way. The Rebbe says master and servant could also be teacher. Master and servant could also be a teacher and a student. And the Rebbe says the teacher has to know that you need to give the student Hanukah, you need to give him these extra gifts. What does this mean? What this means is that a teacher cannot just suffice with teaching the student and just sufficing with that the topic that the student could relate to, but rather you have to give him those extra bonuses, those extra gifts, meaning that when he leaves, like the slave going out free, when the student is going to leave you, he will be able to reach those same highest levels of the Rav itself. And the Rebbe says, a Rav might say, there's a certain kind of seichel that's relatable to the Talmud. I'll give him all of that. I'll review it with him, and I'll make sure he understands the depth of that topic as well. But he might say there are those things that are just completely beyond the seichel of the Talmud. Even the Rav himself would call it Moichen de Gadlus, that even for the Rav, these are very, very high and great levels. That maybe I don't have to give to the Talmud. So the mitzvah of Hanukah is saying no. As a tzedakah, we have to give him, and you have to work with him till he reaches the highest levels that he's capable of reaching eventually. The highest levels, even of the Rav itself. The Rav himself. The Rebbe applies this also in the way we are Makarev, we bring people closer to Yiddishkeit and Torah and mitzvahs. A similar idea, a person could say, this person is only a beginner, isn't it going to be enough that I just teach him those things, that what he's more shaykh to? So the Torah says no. If he's your Talmud, and a Talmud means even if he learned one word from you, one letter from you, you have to give him these extra bonuses, these extra gifts. You have to do with him in a way that he could eventually reach your own level in Yiddishkeit. The Rebbe says through this avodah, Like by the Eved Ivri, it says that he works for 6 years, on the 7th year he goes out. There's also the concept of the 6th millennium, the 6 millennia, and then there's the 7th, which is called Yom Shekul Shabbos U'Menucha L'Chayei Elamim. So through our avodah these days, we should be zoicha that the Eibishter will give us, in addition to all the payment for our work, also these ha'anaka, the bonuses, the greatest giluyim, which are like a tzedakah, completely not compared to all the work that we did. May it come, take it from Yad Mamash.